When I look back at the day my husband, Daniel, shared his wish with me, I realize it was one of those moments that forever reshaped the way I saw love, commitment, and the meaning of us. Our story is not about glittering perfection, but about the raw, human truth of a marriage that was tested, stretched, and ultimately deepened because of one heartfelt request. Daniel and I met in college. I was 20 and stubbornly independent, working part-time at a bookstore, while he was a year older, studying engineering. He wasn't the type to sweep me off my feet with smooth words or grand gestures. Instead, he carried this quiet steadiness, like a safe harbor I didn't know I needed. Over the years, that steady presence became the bedrock of my life. By the time I was 26, we were married, living in a small suburban house in North Carolina, and working hard to build a future. Life was busy, filled with bills, deadlines, and responsibilities, but there was always laughter in our home. We weren't perfect. We argued about dishes, late nights at work, or how to budget money, but we were deeply in love. Then one evening, everything shifted. It was late spring, one of those evenings when the windows were open and the air smelled faintly of fresh grass. I had just finished folding laundry when Daniel called me into the living room. He was sitting on the couch, looking thoughtful in a way that immediately caught my attention. I sat down beside him, searching his face. "What's on your mind?" I asked, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. He hesitated, which was unusual for him. Then he sighed, clasped my hand, and said, "There's something I've been thinking about for a long time. Something I want to share with you. It's a wish of mine." His tone was careful, almost cautious, as though he feared I might misunderstand. "Okay," I said softly. "Tell me." Daniel looked into my eyes with a mix of vulnerability and determination. I've always dreamed of starting something of my own. Not just a career change, but a real venture. I want to open a small woodworking shop. You know how much I love working with my hands. It's been my passion since I was a kid, but I've always pushed it aside because of practicality. I don't want to push it aside anymore. For a moment, I just blinked at him. A woodworking shop? He'd mentioned his love for building furniture before, and our home had several pieces he'd crafted himself. Beautifully sturdy tables, shelves, even the rocking chair in our bedroom. But starting a business? That was a leap into the unknown. He squeezed my hand. "I know it sounds risky. I know we'd have to cut back on expenses, maybe even dip into savings. But this is my wish, Anna. I don't want to look back in 20 years and regret not trying." I stared at him, my heart tugging in two directions. On one side was fear. The fear of financial strain, failure, instability. On the other side was love, the love for this man who had always supported me, who had stood beside me in every storm. I thought of the long nights he'd stayed up helping me study during my nursing program, the way he'd taken extra shifts at his job so I could finish school. Daniel had given me so much without asking for anything in return. And now, here he was, sharing a dream with me, his voice laced with hope. I took a deep breath. "If this is truly what you want, then yes. Let's do it. Let's chase your dream together." His eyes widened, and in that instant, the weight he'd been carrying seemed to lift. He pulled me into a tight embrace, whispering, "Thank you, Anna. You have no idea what this means to me." That was the beginning of a journey that tested us in ways we hadn't anticipated. The first months were the hardest. We transformed the garage into Daniel's workshop, filling it with saws, sanders, and piles of wood. He would work long hours after his day job, pouring his energy into crafting pieces to sell at local markets. I handled the bookkeeping, social media, and customer inquiries, squeezing it in between my shifts at the hospital. Money was tight. There were nights when we ate simple meals of pasta or soup because we couldn't splurge. I remember one particularly tense evening when the electricity bill arrived, higher than expected, and we sat in silence at the kitchen table, the weight of responsibility pressing down on us. "Maybe this was a mistake," I muttered, frustration slipping into my voice. Daniel looked at me, his face tired but steady. "Anna, I know it's hard, but give it time. Please. Trust me." And so I did. Even when doubt gnawed at me, even when friends questioned why we were taking such a big risk, I held on to that trust. Slowly, things began to change. At first, Daniel sold only a few small items, cutting boards, picture frames, simple shelves. But word of mouth spread, and soon customers began placing orders for custom furniture. One woman commissioned a dining table that took Daniel 3 weeks to build. When she came to pick it up, her eyes filled with tears as she ran her hands over the smooth surface. "This is exactly what I wanted," she whispered. Moments like that reminded me why we had said yes to this dream. But the road was not without obstacles. 6 months into the business, Daniel's day job cut back his hours, and the security of a steady paycheck slipped away. We had to lean harder into the woodworking shop, putting everything we had into making it succeed. There were arguments, tears, and nights when I lay awake wondering if we were in over our heads. Then, one evening, after a particularly exhausting week, Daniel came into the bedroom carrying a small wooden box he'd made. He set it on my nightstand and sat beside me. "Open it," he said softly. Inside was a carved wooden heart with the words "Thank you" for believing in me etched across it. Tears filled my eyes. "Daniel," he kissed my forehead. "I know this hasn't been easy, but I couldn't do any of this without you." That heart still sits on my nightstand today, a reminder of why we kept going. A year later, the shop had grown beyond anything we expected. Daniel's pieces were being featured in local magazines, and he'd even been invited to display at an art fair. Customers lined up, not just for furniture, but for the story behind it. The story of a man who followed his dream and a woman who stood by him. Through it all, our marriage transformed. We weren't just husband and wife anymore. We were partners, teammates, dream builders. The struggles we faced together bonded us in ways comfort never could. We learned to communicate better, to fight for one another instead of against one another, and to celebrate small victories along the way. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset after a long day, Daniel slipped his arm around me. "You know," he said, "this all started with a wish. My wish. But none of it would have happened if you hadn't said yes." I leaned against him, my heart full, and I'd say yes 1,000 times over. That night, I realized something profound. Sometimes love isn't about grand gestures or perfect harmony. Sometimes it's about saying yes to the hard, uncertain paths because you believe in the person beside you. Daniel's wish changed our lives. But my yes, our yes, turned that wish into a reality. And in the process, it taught us the true meaning of partnership. Even now, years later, whenever life throws us challenges, we look back at that night in the living room when Daniel first shared his dream.